As a proud supporter of Parkinson's UK, the Focus on Why podcast is supporting this charity by including their Time for Can campaign in this episode.
Can't work, can't walk, can't taste, can't talk, can't move, can't eat, can't remember, can't sleep, can't finish, feel ashamed, can't smile through the pain, can't stop the voices, can't make it stop. Parkinson's, the fastest growing neurological condition in the world. There is no cure. Yet we can fund, can fight, can discover, can unite, can transform, can live, can change, can give, can slow, can stop, can reverse, can cure. We can do, but we can't do it without you. Parkinson's UK. Together we can find a cure. Donate now at parkinsons.org.uk.
Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Today on the Focus on Why podcast, I am joined by Jerry Tate. Welcome, Jerry.
Hello. Hi, Amy. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. And we've been brought together by the lovely Michelle Bryant, who recommended that you come on the podcast.
Great. Okay.
So why don't you start by explaining to the audience what it is you do?
So my name's Jerry Tate. I'm a partner in an architecture practice called Tate Harmer Architects. So with my partner Rory, who's sat behind me, and we run an architecture practice. We're based in Dalston, but we work all over the UK and sometimes internationally as well. And we specialise really in sustainable buildings, which are set into very sensitive landscape settings or very sensitive heritage settings, or often both, actually. So sort of sensitive and landscape and heritage mix, if you like. And that's us.
So explain to me how you got into architecture.
Well, architecture is one of those things where if you are at school and you can draw, basically, and you say you want to be an artist, but you still pass maths and physics, they tell you that you have to go and do architecture, that you can't just go and do art. So you do kind of get steered into architecture. If you're one of those kids at school who can draw, you do kind of get steered into architecture if you're good at kind of the other stuff as well. But I have to say, actually, also, I grew up in Suffolk, really, which is there's not a huge variety of professions in Suffolk. And I learned to paint a lot with my gran, who lived in Woodbridge. And in Woodbridge, there was also an architecture practice that I used to hang around a bit as well, called Mullins and Dowse. And I was used to think, this is nice. You know, these people, they get to draw all day. That's what I really like, with pens. You know, it's the old days when you didn't use computers. It's fantastic. It's what I want to do. So there you go. So yeah, that's kind of how I fell into it, really.
So more of a steer as opposed to a choice.
Although I wanted to be an architect from a very early age, actually. I think from the age of 14, I kind of knew that was what I wanted to do. And it's quite interesting. A lot of architects are quite dedicated like that. And I think that what happens is between starting an architecture practice, starting an architecture course and finishing, actually qualifying, there's something ridiculous like a 50-60% dropout rate. Because it's 7 years long, it's actually the individual degrees are quite good foundations to go into other things like, for example, web development or special effects or something like that. So quite a lot of people go into an architecture course and then spin off into something else, basically. And it's the ones who kind of started the course really wanting to be architects who tends to be the ones who come out the other end and actually qualify, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So where did you choose to study your architecture?
I studied in 3 different places, actually, and it's quite interesting, your sort of journey through what you understand, because when you start an architecture course, you actually don't know much about it, so you're not necessarily making fully informed decisions, but then your parameters change as you go. So I decided to study at Nottingham University, which was at the time quite a small course, but a very kind of like solid professional course. And particularly, there was a couple there called Robert and Brenda Vale, who I really liked, who at the time, and this is sort of 1993, they were the sort of green architects, the sustainable architects in the UK. And that was a time when sustainability just wasn't, so much of a thing, and people thought they were ridiculous building, houses with triple glazing and half a metre of insulation. They're like, why are you doing that? They're really ahead of the curve. It's really interesting kind of doing a degree with them, and I really enjoyed it. It's a really good kind of technical base. But they left after my second year. Actually, they moved to New Zealand, and sort of Nottingham then kind of lost its appeal for me, and I got interested in a place called the Bartlett, which was the Department for Architecture at University College London, which at that point, about 3 or 4 years earlier, had been taken over by a very famous luminary called Peter Cook, who was a big teacher at the AA. He's a very famous guy. He's part of a group called Archigram, very sort of exciting architects in the 60s and the 70s. And he's a real, I don't know how to put this really, it's a real bad boy. Do you know what I mean? Like he's really up for changing things. He's really, really interesting, fantastic person, really sparky. And he had taken over the Bartlett and just completely changed it into this sort of place that was spinning off this amazing, interesting work. And you just saw this amazing work coming out of the Bartlett. I thought, I want to study there. So it's quite hard to do the transition from Nottingham to the Bartlett, because Nottingham had very much the opposite attitude to architecture. It was very steady Eddie, and it was kind of based on Corbusier, and it's quite kind of fixed in its attitudes. So I then went and worked for someone who worked at the Bartlett, because I thought that's a good way to get into it, basically, to be honest with you. So I went and did a year out with a fantastic bloke called Kieran Tan, who I'm still in touch with a lot. So in architecture, what you do is you do a degree, then you do a year out, and then you do a diploma or a master's, and you do another year, and then you're qualified, basically. So that's a sort of 7-year process. So I went and worked for Kieran. It was, again, like actually great, but kind of mad, because he had jobs all over the world. He lived half in Singapore and half in London, partly because he liked that, partly also, the brutal truth at that point, it wasn't so cool to be gay in Singapore. And so, he sort of had slightly double lives as well. But, and that was really fantastic fun. I learnt loads with Kieran. That was sort of the start of my introduction to the Bartlett. And then I did 2 years at the Bartlett with under a tutor called Nat Shard, and obviously Peter, who was involved with everything at the Bartlett at that point, because he's now sort of, he'd kill me for saying this, but he's quite old, Peter, and, you can't keep up what he used to be like, but he's just a force of nature, really. And he's everywhere, and he knew everyone, and he'd have dinners and lectures, and it's very exciting. And that was great fun doing 2 years at the Bartlett. Just absolutely doing the most incredible, interesting work. Also doing things like learning how to weld and do proper metal work and do proper joinery. Had a really good workshop with really kind of keen staff who could teach you stuff. So I really enjoyed that, and that. I think the Bartlett was like 101 for design, basically. The best analogy I've ever heard is the Bartlett teaches you to play the rock guitar, if that makes sense. So if I wanted you to kind of, if you wanted to get really good at playing the rock guitar, it's probably not going to help you too much immediately to learn the history of the classical guitar. Like, it might be useful in the end if you want to keep going with it, but if you want to get going right now, you've just got to pick up a guitar and play. And the Bartlett's very much like playing the rock guitar. So that was fun. And then actually what happened was I came out of the Bartlett and worked for a company called Grimshaw for a few years, basically, and had a really interesting time there. And I guess we're going to come back to that as sort of, professional stuff. But one of the things I did between Grimshaw and starting my own practice was I took a sort of further break, if you like, and went back into academia and did a master's at Harvard University. And the reason I did that was actually because I felt like I did want to learn the history of the classical guitar. It's quite interesting, So I sort of been playing the rock guitar for a number of years, and then suddenly I want to know what this is all about, really. Where does this all come from? And what Harvard is particularly good at is sort of, the critical theory base, basically. So it helps you understand like the whole history of architecture and where you kind of sit in that process, which is useful. Not necessarily in a day-to-day professional basis, but useful for us, when we're thinking about what we're up to as a practice and why we're doing what we're doing. I mean, it's not accidental. You kind of are who you are. So, we run a sustainable practice, and that's what we do. But that's also, we run a sustainable practice because we think that is the most pressing design issue facing the profession right now. And so you might as well just say up front, that's what we're doing, because that's the problem that we've got to solve. There you go. Blimey, that was a bit long, wasn't it? Sorry.
No, it's not long at all.
It's a long course. That's the trouble.
Brilliant. So you're talking about sustainability, and you're talking about how you're working with sensitive landscape and heritage. What is the key point for you for doing that?
So I think that there's a few things in there. You know, there's a technical thing about building a building which doesn't use a lot of energy, doesn't use too much water, sits lightly on the earth, doesn't damage the environment that it's in. You know, there's all of those things, which actually, when people talk about zero carbon, they tend to sort of, when people talk about sustainability, actually, they're quite often talking about kind of technically operational zero carbon. And then there's the other thing that's coming, which is embodied carbon. So when people talk about carbon, that's the carbon emissions associated with the energy, basically. So people tend to measure energy use in terms of carbon emissions. And there's this technical stuff in buildings about how much carbon does your building emit on a day-to-day basis, and how much carbon did it require to build your building. And in terms of sustainability, that is really important, right? And that's something that we're really passionate about. We know a lot about it and we really like it. But what I'm really keen on is that sustainability is seen in a much more holistic and broad manner, because sustainability is also about providing a great place for people to live, allowing, in terms of things like good daylight, good natural ventilation, a healthy place to be. Also about promoting good community interaction and good social interaction, and being a nice place and a good kind of base for a community or an institution or a family to live. And then feeding into that then is its relationship to its immediate environment. And one of the things that we're very passionate about is that people have an opportunity to connect with and understand kind of beautiful natural settings. So a lot of our clients are sort of a bit like that. Like, we do a lot of work for the National Trust, say, or the Habitat First Group, Scout Association, and that's their thing. So then it becomes about, how do you start making these buildings, which are sustainable buildings, but how do you make these buildings which allow people to experience that natural environment whilst obviously protecting it at the same time? So it's quite a difficult but interesting balance, and it's something we really enjoy as a challenge, actually.
And how are you helping the environment become more urban, because that's what's needed, but also stay as natural as possible?
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question in terms of sort of, the amount of space in the world which is taken up by urban development is due to double over the next 20 to 30 years, basically. So that's like a massive wallop of urban development. And actually, after that, interestingly, it is supposed to tail off. So actually, after that, the kind of population levels out, and the urban growth kind of is supposed to slow down. But obviously, if we are going to expand the amount of land that's taken up by urban development that much, we need to start thinking about how we integrate the green infrastructure, people call it, which is basically, nature. It's the soft stuff. It's how do we get wildlife and trees and ecology into our urban setting, and how can we thread that through all of our developments? And actually, the thing that we're up to now, if you like, we started on one side, which is, for about 10 years, really, we've been building buildings in sensitive landscape settings. But now, of course, we're getting much more, as our work starts to get bigger, we're getting much more work in kind of urban and places like London environments. So the thing then becomes, instead of folding it into a sensitive natural setting, how do you fold a natural setting into an urban environment? And that's the sort of problem that we're starting to really focus on now. And I think that's kind of really interesting. And it comes back to, I grew up in Suffolk, and I had a lovely, like, Enid Blyton type childhood, and it's brilliant, and I could go and play in the stream, and I could mess around in a field, and I could run through the woods. But the nearest best mate was Martin Dyer, and he was 3 miles away. And it was really hard to cycle because it was in the days when people smashed it down country roads, basically. So you're a little bit isolated, And now I live in North London, which is fantastic. And I live in North London. I see my neighbours on the way to work. My kids can pop round and see their friends. And actually, we're quite well provisioned in North London in terms of parks and stuff, which is what makes it a nice place to be. But the risk is that you make these urban environments which are really good for this sort of social interaction, but lose that connection to nature that I really enjoyed as a child. And really, I think it's very important. One of the things that we're really passionate about is creating those environments that kind of maintain that link, essentially.
And how do you weave in the wildlife into a more sort of stage setting?
Yeah, no, well, that's a really good question. First of all, you have to allow space for it. And it might be that allowing space for it involves making a slightly denser development, generally to allow space for these sort of elements of landscape to come into your space. So thing number one is like strategizing for it and building it into your brief and what you plan to do. But thing number two is actually thinking about it before you get too far down the line in terms of design. And what happens is normally with green stuff that there's an amount of green stuff and it's drawn as green on a plan and that's it, and it goes boom. And it's quite a big lump and it's in the middle of kind of big things. So there's a big lump of green and then there's lots of houses around it and that's it. What's the two things that are more interesting than that, than doing that we think as a strategy? So thing number one is threading the green throughout the development. So having things like green corridors going through developments, having smaller little pocket parks as well as a kind of giant lump of green in the middle, because you tend to find that people want to have the green that they access on a day-to-day basis is something that's kind of immediately available, something that kids can run to and play in, for example. People can walk around without walking a long way. If you can see it from your window, that is particularly strong. The other thing is actually to be really clear about what the different elements of green are for, which is a bit like saying being careful about designing them, but actually it's a bit more strategic than that. So not every element of green is a bit of grass, for example. So it's quite, when you discuss green infrastructure in a city, you quite often think of a parkland and you think that's what it should be. But there are also areas of wildlife, potentially. There are also areas of kind of more richer ecology. There are also areas of woodland. There are also wetland areas. There's there's quite a rich ecological base and palette for us to choose from. And it comes from the briefing stage, really, actually, the very early setting up of the project, that you start to establish what different bits of green can do for you and how they can be integrated into your urban development.
And you talked about some of your clients being the National Trust and the Scout Association, that they're on board with this. What about developers? How easy is it for you to talk to clients about the importance of the development, including the green space?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, actually. And I think that is changing. And the type of developers who are coming forwards now are changing. There is a new generation of developers. I won't name any names, but I think that there are some very established sort of house builder or large-scale developers who are understanding this is coming, but aren't really on board with achieving it, if that makes sense. There are people who we work with who obviously, I think, really get it. So, for example, we're working with Kieran at the moment, Kieran Developments, who are part of Yorkshire Water. And they're quite typical of the kind of people we work with. We quite often work with developers who own a lot of land. So there'll be an estate, or there'll be a farmer, or there'll be someone who's got an understanding of kind of wide sections of ownership of land and a kind of very long-term interest in the land. And so, we're doing some houses up at Esholt for Keyland at the moment, 150 houses. And it's all about kind of water and landscape and management of water and creating a better, sustainable, carbon positive community, because that's what they're like as a company. Yorkshire Water obviously aren't going anywhere. They have a really, really long-term interest in the land. So there's those type of developers who are kind of naturally going in that way, and they're the people who employ us right now. Then there's also then a crop of developers who are kind of more recent on the market. So we've worked with some of them. So Hab Housing, for example, which is Kevin MacLeod founded that, and they're doing some really fantastic work in terms of building communities. But there are also people like Igloo or Town who we're working with as part of the Quality of Life Foundation at the moment. So I had a workshop yesterday with them, and they are very seriously looking at the whole aspect of quality of life, basically, and how you can build communities that have a sense of wonder about them, and trying to work out what that wonder is. And one of the things we talked about yesterday is actually, there's things that we think, there's things I think, obviously, about greenery, and there is some data on that. But there's a few things that we would, as a foundation, they're looking at doing. So gathering some data on exactly what benefits that provides, but also asking people, in a very kind of popular place where people think it's a wonderful place to live, what is it about this space that you find wonderful? And seeing how then we can bring that forwards in sort of our new developments.
When you talk about quality of life, are you talking about well-being?
Yes, I mean, it is in lots of ways to do with health and well-being, I think. And again, one of the things we see in our work is that is something which is being more and more understood by the general public. Because in the end, right, we're making products that people are going to buy. I mean, architects don't like to think that they're a consumer-driven design discipline, but the truth is, people have got to want to live in what we all want to work in and want to get taught in stuff that we're designing. And I think certainly post-COVID now, people are becoming kind of acutely aware of how where they live affects their health and well-being, both in terms of things like, they've got a nice natural setting that they can easily access, so there's a bit of greenery, that they've got good daylight and good ventilation, and it's a nice place to hang out, especially if you're at home all day in lockdown. Suddenly you start really understanding, that your home environment can really affect your mood. And also particularly things then about social interactions. So, in your day-to-day interactions in your neighbourhood, can you bump into people? Do you see people? Is there somewhere for you to do basic things like pop and buy a pint of milk without getting in a car? The other thing about quality of life, of course, we talk about a lot is recent housing developments of say, 10 years ago, quite often prioritised the car a lot in terms of their kind of layout, as opposed to the community, and the community should be something that's more important than the car. The question about what is a street for, things like that. So yes, health and well-being is a thing that's becoming more and more to the fore, and we see that as well. Another part of our work is hotels, actually, and that is the trend right now with hotel work is improving. They call it the health and well-being offer, which sounds a bit kind of cynical, doesn't it? But the truth is that what they're talking about there is better food, good local supply chain, somewhere nice to do yoga. It's actually quite a lot of very interesting and good holistic things, which can at the same time, make them a more broadly sustainable institution.
So what I'm seeing here and what I'm hearing is the huge amount of responsibility that you're taking on to shape the way that we're going to be living going forward, and taking that responsibility to home people, but also to provide a home which is going to provide a better quality of life.
Yes, absolutely. Well, so it's interesting you should say that, though, because it is a big responsibility, right? You're drawing something and someone's got to live there. And, we do hotels, homes, and we do schools and universities, right? So in all of those, someone's either going to live there or they're going to stay there the night and have a nice, and it's got to operate well as a business and people got to enjoy it, or they're going to be educated in there. And then if you're a kid, you don't have any choice. You've got to be in that classroom. So it is a big responsibility. But the flip side of that is I would say that architects are a component in a broader chain, if you like. So architects swim in the ecosystem of the building industry, and building industry, at the very top of that, there are kind of the funders and the banks, who are quite often pension funds, actually, who pay for the buildings. Below them are the developers, who are the people who put together the money and the design team and the land, and they have a sort of quite an instigating role in setting it all up. And then we're in the design team layer, if you like. So we coordinate the structural engineers, the M&E engineers, the ecologists, the arboriculturists, the heritage consultants, all those people, to create a design. And then the people who then kind of follow what we say, if you like, in terms of the drawings, are the contractors, if you like. So the contractors, and then below the contractors are the subcontractors. So they're people like, the plumbers or the bricklayers and all those people. So there's a sort of quite kind of broad ecosystem, and we are kind of in the middle of that ecosystem. So I think we have a massive responsibility, but I think everyone in that ecosystem is part of that responsibility at the same time. And it really works when everyone gets it. It really works. And the reason I say that is because I really understood that when I started my career at Grimshaw as the project architect for a lot of the Eden project down in Cornwall. So we still work with the Eden project a lot now, actually. We're kind of in the middle of designing a hotel for them and stuff like that. And they're fabulous clients. But, on Eden, everything was aligned in terms of what they were trying to do. The people who essentially paid for the Eden project in the first stage were the Millennium Commission, who had very clear objectives about sustainability and education. Then you got to Eden, who's Tim Smith and a lot of biologists, basically, who really understood their mission. Then you get down from that, and there's McAlpines and the design team, who, again, as contractors and architects and design team members, all understood it. And then they had workshops to make sure that all the subcontractors working on the project understood it as well. So actually, when all of that responsibility you're talking about is understood vertically right through the supply chain, that's when you get, an inspirational and incredible sustainable project, basically. So, God, I've made it sound very complicated building a building, haven't I? Gosh, sorry about that.
Well, one thing I want to pick up on, though, is you're talking about the top layer being the banks and the pension funds. Now, they're looking for returns. They're looking for huge returns. Is it easy, or is it possible to create sustainable developments and still deliver those returns?
Yeah, well, okay. So there's two things on that, actually. So thing number one is, what return are they looking for, actually? So and how fast is it? And what is it? So they are all looking for return, but not all of them are looking for the same kind of return. Some of them are looking to hold on to something, get an income. Some of them are looking to get their money in and get it out again. So they're looking to kind of flip it. Some of them are specialist funds which have quite clear ethical requirements, for example. So they have to invest in certain types of projects. So it's sort of so that's kind of slightly sidetracking your question. I'm really sorry about that. But, it's just like what we find is that the people handing out the money quite often have an agenda, and it's really important to understand what that agenda is. Because, for example, also we do projects that are things like heritage fund projects, where that's essentially the lottery who hand out money to create new museum projects and things like that. And they have a very different set of criteria to, say, a bank on a short-term loan basis, and they have a very different criteria to like a fund like Aberdeen Standard, who generally want to hold on to stuff and get a steady income. So the reason I say that is because depending on who you're talking to, depends on how you can frame the sustainable conversation. And you're totally right, because actually what your question is like, how can we present this stuff to make sure it happens? Because if we can't demonstrate there is a kind of basic financial return, then there's a risk that it will just kind of fall by the wayside. People say, well, that's very nice, but why am I going to pay a bit more money for that? Kind of thing.
And going back to, yeah, go on.
Oh, well, no. So, I mean, things like Aberdeen Standards say, what you find with them is that you can talk to them about ongoing costs. So one of the ways to talk to them about sustainability is you are going to keep hold of this building for a long period of time. And we need to make sure that it is a decent building that gives you a decent return, but also that doesn't use too much energy, that doesn't use too much water, because you are essentially going to have to pay those bills. A bit like someone you're building a house for. So when we started our practice, we were building new build houses. People, we still do that now. I love it. But with them, they're going to pay the bills. So all kind of owner-occupier people, sustainability, you can talk to them in terms of kind of payback. Then there's the people who have a kind of broader outlook on what they're doing. So say someone like Kieran, for example. Kieran are also, they're not just beholden to financial return, they're also beholden to Ofwat, who have to demonstrate that they are innovative and sustainable to Ofwat. And they also hold a lot of natural capital, it's called, hold a lot of land. So with them, for example, they work on a 6 capitals model. So there's natural, but there's also human, manufactured, intellectual, financial, and manufactured. I don't know if I said that already, sorry. Anyway, there's 6 different capital models, and they assess all of them to determine the payback of their project. And one of those is financial, basically. So that's the structure that they've got in terms of their finance. The most difficult people to persuade, though, you're totally right, are the ones who they want to build it and to sell it. And the reason that's difficult is at the moment, and I think this might change, at the moment it's very hard to demonstrate you can essentially sell a sustainable house for more money than a not sustainable house, if that makes sense. And Actually, that probably is true, right? Like, probably it's true that if you build a good house with good landscape and good daylight, and it's got low energy bills, it almost certainly is actually going to sell better. But you don't demonstrate it at the end. What we're talking about is the finance at the beginning. When you're setting up the structure of that, you have to demonstrate that that is true. And there just isn't sufficient data at the moment on that to show that. So I think you're right. In that situation there, you have to be working for a developer who believes that they can get a better return, because that is the kind of thing that they do. That makes sense. And it has to be as much about belief than it is about hard data. And that's back to people like, Town, also people like Habitat First Group who've done work for, that's their thing. They're going to essentially sell their products, sell their houses, sell their homes on the basis that it is a better community for you to live in. You're going to have a nicer space.
So on the sort of rock star to classical guitar spectrum or continuum, how open to innovation and sort of, or how resistant? I mean, what's going on with the construction industry to what you're presenting as being sustainable? Are they on board?
Yes. So it's quite interesting, actually. So there are a few things which shift a bit when you want to build a sustainable building. Traditionally in the UK, kind of most small-scale stuff is masonry construction, actually. So it's called block and brick cavity walls. So if you see all the Barratt homes going up, they're actually changing now, to be fair to them, but all the old-fashioned Barratt homes are kind of block, insulation, brick. Generally, that's how a lot of buildings are built in the UK. And then at scale, then, what you find is that they're quite often steel frame with composite aluminium cladding. So, but one of the things you find is as soon as you start to have a conversation about, I'd like to create a building which has low operational carbon emissions. So I essentially want it to use less energy. And also I want a building that has low embodied carbon. So I want it to not have created lots of carbon by me building it. You really start coming down to timber frames, essentially. So timber frames are really good because they can allow you to have thick walls of insulation. So you can have up to like 150, 200, some of our buildings have 300 mil of insulation thickness. A normal house would have about 100. In a masonry construction, that makes a ridiculously thick wall, whereas in a timber frame construction, you have room to be able to kind of achieve that. And you can also do a lot of things like prefabrication with a timber frame and make a very kind of airtight building. That's not to say that you don't get any fresh air in, because you do put fresh air in and stuff, but it's just that if you want to not lose air through drafts, building with a timber frame is a really good thing. So it's a really good way of building a low operational energy building. But also, if you look at all the different materials you can use, from masonry, concrete, steel, timber is the only one which is carbon positive. So by growing a tree and putting it into a building, you are removing carbon from the atmosphere. Whereas every other material, in kind of superstructure terms, if you like, is emitting carbon in its manufacture. So again, in terms of embodied carbon, which is the other half of the equation, it's just much better. Now, the reason I was doing all that is to explain the benefits of timber frame, because timber frame in the UK is something which is growing now, I have to say, quite fast. But at the start, we had a lot of resistance to timber frame, and we had meetings with developers 10 years ago where we said, we really like timber frames. A lot of our buildings are timber frames, or majority timber frames, because of those reasons. And they would be very resistant to using timber frame because it's not the norm. They didn't really know it. They'd never used it before. They didn't understand it. In parts of Europe, it's the norm. If you build a house in Germany, it's always going to be timber framed. And in Sweden and Scandiland, they do really big, quite big CLT timber frame constructions. To be fair now, there are a lot more timber frame manufacturers in the UK than there were. I think when we built the education facilities down at Eden, there were about 3 who we could talk to. Now, there's at least 2 or 3 in every county, which is brilliant. So it's really picking up the pace, and it is changing. And I think it's going to have to, actually, because there is no escaping the fact that we will have to a certain extent, legislate our way through to zero carbon. That it'll have to be enforced. And once it starts becoming enforced, timber frame will have to become the sort of majority way of building buildings in the UK. That doesn't mean they're all going to be timber clad, actually. You can still clad a timber frame building in brick, so they're not necessarily going to look different, but I think we'll have to start thinking about our buildings differently.
So what for you is the big mission? Why still architecture after all these years?
There is, I'll tell you the truth about architecture is architects are all addicted to the fact that you draw something and then it exists. That is just like absolutely addictive as a thing. So that's one thing, just to say that's actually why most architects still do architecture. It's just the most addictive thing to draw something and then walk around it later on and think, oh my God, I drew this and now it's built. That is an absolutely, absolutely wonderful feeling. It's brilliant. I think all architects, and certainly us, we like to think that we are making a positive difference by what we do. That's really the only reason for doing what we're doing. And so, by through the philosophy which we use to do the design of our buildings, we're creating something which is better than what could have been and better than what has been in the past. And when we say better, our particular thing about better is broadly sustainability. So we think that is the problem to solve right now. So that is where buildings need to get better, if you like. And that is our mission, really. And I think, if we can build like 10 really lovely, good, medium to big size buildings that show the philosophy and show that it can work, it didn't cost too much money, it was a reasonable thing to have done, but it created these wonderful environments that connect you with nature and don't use too much energy and tread lightly on the earth. That'd be brilliant. That'd be fine. That'd be enough. We just point to those, and we did those. Look, we shifted it a bit,
And that's the company mission. What about you as a person?
Yeah. Well, no. So this is the interesting about running an architecture practice that you tend to, me and Rory are both, I would say, really good architects, right? Like that's step one. I think we're very good at the trade. But what happens is that you're actually making a platform for other people to do the design work in. So what you're really doing is creating a company to help other people achieve your mission, or the mission of the company. Sorry, So my personal goal is to create a scalable design platform where people can work and be happy. And in the same way as we want to make, sustainable places where people, really enjoy being, we want to make a sustainable company where people really enjoy being, and they can do the best work they've done in their lives, and it helps the company move towards its sustainable mission. So you have to be quite careful about not conflating your kind of architectural ambitions with what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. On a day-to-day basis, really, I'm setting up a platform to help other people do the best architecture work they can. There's a really good book by Ed Catmull called Creativity Inc., and he was the president of Pixar. And it is a really good quote in it where he says, when you're running a creative company, the risk is that you think that you're the one driving the train, but that's not true. You're the person laying the track, and you've got to let other people drive the train because otherwise they won't know where they're going. And I think that's just a brilliant quote, actually, and something that it's good to bear in mind.
Well, they certainly got it right at Pixar, that's for sure.
No, absolutely. But what Pixar do is they get the best out of people. Actually, that it's not that complicated. Actually, Pixar from everyone at Pixar understands what Pixar are doing, but they do the best work they've ever done in their lives at Pixar. And I hope that we can create an architecture practice, that does the same. I mean, I'm not saying we're going to be the next Pixar, by the way. That sounds a bit megalomaniac. I mean, we're probably more modest than that, just to say.
No, I think what you're saying is that it all comes down to people.
It is all people. I mean, that's the truth, right? You start architecture, you think it's about the buildings, but actually it's all about people. And the buildings only exist because people want to do a certain activity. That's the other thing you've always got to be careful of. That when people come to us and they say, what we need is a block of 8 classrooms, say, and it's this, this, and this. Your job is actually to work out the activity they're trying to achieve or the change they're trying to achieve at first, and then check whether 8 classrooms is actually going to achieve that change for them. Because, the most sustainable thing to do actually is to build nothing. That's terrible. I'm writing myself out of a job. But, if you can build nothing, that is more sustainable than building anything, actually. So, there is a careful thing you need to do at the very start of a project, which is just to say, right, it's about people and people want to do stuff. And that's why this building exists. So I think that's the interesting thing about the whole coronavirus thing right now, and one of the reasons why the building industry is in a bit of flux is, except for homes, everyone has to have a home, right? So that's like a constant. But even that is changing because the type of homes that people want to live in is sort of changing. No one quite knows what people are going to do in offices exactly, in 2 years' time. No one quite knows what the future of retail and exactly the future of restaurants is. No one quite knows what the future of hotels is. And when they say that, what they mean is they don't really know exactly what the people in them are going to be doing. And if you don't know what the people who kind of occupy these spaces and the communities that live in them want to achieve or want to do on a day-to-day and on a long-term basis, it's very hard to design something which is a support mechanism for that. Because that's what architecture is. It's basically a support mechanism for life. Really, you're making a shelter for people to do things in.
And Jerry, do you ever switch off?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, well, a bit. Yeah, I go cycling a lot. I've got to say that's my thing. Well, I've got 3 boys actually, so I have to say thing number 1 is mainly I spend a lot of time with 3 boys trying to keep them busy because anyone who's got kids knows this is true, but certainly anyone who's got 3 boys knows that you have to keep them active, otherwise they're going to go mental in the evening. So a lot of my time is spent trying to exhaust them. So
I know you like your longer cycle rides there, Jerry, as well.
Yeah, no, I do enjoy ridiculously long cycle rides, and actually I have a sort of annual thing that I do every year where we all cycle down to a property conference called MIPIM in the south of France. And MIPIM is a sort of big international conference. I think there's about 500 British people who go, and now about 150 of the British contingents. There's 500 British people that go, 150 of them now cycle down there all of the way from London to Cannes in the south of France. And it's really fantastic. It's all raising money for a charity called Coram, if people know that. It's a sort of the oldest children's charity, basically. So, and normally it raises about £500,000. So it's a sort of wonderful thing to be doing. It's a very long way to cycle. I mean, it's quite a monastic ride. But I've done it sort of 4 or 5 years in a row now, although this year we couldn't really do it because coronavirus happened. So we actually ended up doing laps around Regent's Park instead for the same distance. So it's about 1,500 kilometres from London to Cannes. So we did 1,500 kilometres around Regent's Park, which was very tedious, but we did it still and we got the money in. So that was good. But so that's what I enjoy. Crazy long monastic cycle rides.
And tell me a bit about Coram and what they do.
Well, so Coram are, they're based down near Cromsfields in Bloomsbury. They're the oldest children's charity I think in the world. They support a lot of children with problems, essentially. But one of the key things they do is they're an adoption charity, but they support children through the adoption process. So a lot of adoptions actually fail quite early on, but pretty much no adoptions fail with Coram because they have this sort of wonderful support system in place. They also have sort of intervention program to help children from disadvantaged backgrounds get on really and kind of rebalance the equity of childhood. They're really great. If people look them up, they're a fantastic charity. So.
Well, and did you manage to raise that even though you didn't do the physical race this year? Did you still manage to raise the money?
Yeah. We still raised money. Look, I was actually a bit scared because I had to email all my sponsors and say, because I had $5,500 of sponsorship or something. We're not actually going to Cannes, but I'm going to do it around Regent's Park with some other people. Do you want your money back, kind of thing? I wasn't quite sure how it all worked, but luckily everybody said no, that's fine, and you can keep the money. So I think they didn't raise quite as much this year because I think there's a sort of a follow-on that happens. But anyway, I think if people could look up Coram, they could probably do us some help.
Oh, brilliant. So you do switch off. That's good to know. I just think with your sort of architect's vision all the time, you must be constantly thinking of ideas, concepts and the future of what you could make a difference, how you make that positive impact.
Yeah, no, you do. You do. And you're always looking at things, thinking how you would have improved things, and you're a bit critical on both yourself and other things that you see. But the flip side of that, of course, is again, it's back to this sort of like we do swim in an ecosystem in the building industry. Actually, what's really important and what we're always trying to tell ourselves is it's back to your thing about the people, right? So say, for example, we're doing the Brunel Museum at the moment. So it's a fantastic job. It's lovely. We're doing down in Rotherhithe. It's Brunel's Isambard's first structure. We did some work on it a few years ago. It's the first tunnel under a river ever, and we made something called the sinking shaft, which is a big cavern by it into a performance space. And now we've got a great grant from the Heritage Fund to make it into a museum above. It's an operational museum right now, but we're going to help with a new cafe and things. Those projects, they're not about us, right? They're about the museum and Brunel. And actually, it's really important we get into that mindset and understand that, it's not about our architectural genius. What it's really about is helping them express what it means to be a museum in Brunel's first structure, talking about, Mark Brunel and then Isambard, his son, who took it over, and what that relationship was and what it meant for engineering in the UK. That's not our story. That's someone else's story, and we're helping tell it. That's the same for all projects, actually. So we are always thinking of things we could do and things we could improve, but at the same time, we're normally problem solving somebody else's world, if that makes sense. Quite often we're occupying someone else's zone, and we're working out what we can do for them to help that kind of work better, if that makes sense.
Oh, I love that. No, it's fantastic. Jerry, it's been such a great episode together. I really feel like we've explored the world of, music and architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I've really enjoyed it, Amy. Thank you. It's lovely to chat to you. Yeah, it's great.
So how would someone get in touch with you if they want you to help them with their vision?
Well, the best place to go is our website, which is tateharmer.com. So that's TateHarmer.com. There's all the handles are on there, and there's a studio email you can send stuff to that comes straight to me, actually. So all of the contacts there will come to us, and we love to hear from people. And even if you're just thinking about doing something, get in touch. It's always lovely to talk to people. So please do.
Fabulous. Well, they'll all go in the show notes, so I'll make sure that all of the website and all the handles that you mentioned are in there as well. Do you have a final message to the audience?
I would actually. I mean, I've banged on about sustainability, right? And I feel a bit like I worry about it. Sounds a bit like a kind of like telling people off, right? Sustainability. And so there's only two things. I'm going to say two things. Is that right? I'm going to cheat. I'm really sorry. Thing number one is the thing that Tim Smith always said, which is actually sustainability should be a really positive message. That if I said to you, you're going to have a nicer home with better daylight, and it's going to have better landscape, and you're going to wear better clothes, and you're going to be happier, and your skin's going to be better, all that stuff, that's a good thing, right? And that is what sustainability should be. That's thing number one. And then thing number two is that also when you look at it, you feel like, oh God, this guy's telling me I've got to use less energy, and I've got to do all this stuff, and I've got to buy locally, and all that. It just sounds like a lot to get done, but every tiny little bit you do is great, right? So if you just buy more local, from a kind of buy from a market, not always from a supermarket, or you just use slightly less energy, or you just put a water-saving tap on one of your sinks, or all of that stuff. Every tiny little bit helps loads, basically. And it's one of those things where small things really matter.
Thank you for listening to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and if you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star Apple Podcast review. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram and Facebook, and become a member of my inspiring, uplifting and positive Focus on Why Facebook group. I help people to focus on their why with clarity, uniting their passion with their purpose with a plan to create the life they truly desire. If you would like me to help you focus on your why, then please book a free 20-minute coaching call via calendly.com/Amy Rowlandson. And if you haven't already, please sign up for the Friday Focus weekly newsletter via my website, amyrowlandson.com. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.